All right, hey everybody, can you hear me okay? It's about 5 minutes after, and I think we'll get started in just a minute here. My cat keeps attacking me. We have a new kitten, and he keeps coming after me, so if you hear any rustling, it's probably me just trying to gently keep him from walking on the keyboard. Let me know if you can hear me okay. All right, cool. Hey Yarrow, good to see you. Aaron, yes, you can hear me. All right, good. Sound's coming through good. Nice. All right. Well, I hope everybody's having a good day. I'm having a good morning here. It's kind of cooler, foggy, possible rain, but it doesn't look like it's going to amount to much if it does rain, so it's still nice to see a cloud once in a while. Um, yeah, I'm looking forward to today's class. It's all about hand pollination. So we're going to go over squash hand pollination and corn hand pollination, and then talk a little bit about seed storage. So like the last couple of classes, I think let's keep going with this formula of just kind of running through the presentation and saving the Q&A for the end. There's probably going to be some questions around both the squash and corn hand pollination, I'm imagining. But I'll do my best to explain it thoroughly. and we'll do a good Q&A at the end. Sound good? All right, hey Alex, nice, I'm glad you could show up. All right, well, welcome to Module 6 of Seed Saving Fundamentals. Glad you all could join again today. Like I mentioned, today we're going to talk about hand pollination of squash and corn, and we're going to talk about seed storage. This Saturday we'll be doing another Q&A, 9 a.m. Pacific time. So if anybody has any questions from this week, show up then and we'll discuss it more. And let's get right into it. So we're going to cover squash and corn hand pollination. I'm going to start with squash. This is the one that I have more experience doing and really enjoy doing, and it's probably the easiest of all of the common vegetable plants to hand pollinate. And so some of the reasons for hand pollinating squash are if you have insufficient natural pollinators present in your garden or on your farm. Bees are the most common pollinators for squash, and in some cases folks don't have a lot of bees around. There are a lot of other insects that do pollinate squash. Basically any flying insect, a lot of the bad insects like cucumber beetles or squash bugs actually do a lot of pollination. So sometimes you might actually notice that your fruits aren't pollinating. And so hand pollination is a way to ensure that. Another reason is to preserve an heirloom variety from unwanted cross-pollination. So even though that squash can be self-pollinated with hand pollination, or if there's just a single plant, they will cross, basically up to the distance that the insects will fly. So with bees, that's, you know, half a mile to a mile is a good distance to isolate. You might hand pollinate if you want to breed your own variety of squash. So maybe there's two varieties of the same species of squash that you want to cross just for experimentation. Or if you have different traits from two different varieties that you want to combine potentially and create your own variety, you can easily do that with hand pollination. And squash doesn't show inbreeding depression. So if you recall from previous modules discussing inbreeding depression, when too few plants are included in the breeding population and there's not enough genetics, that the following generations will have problems because of that. Squash doesn't show that. So even though it'll cross, A single plant can pollinate itself and you won't see any inbreeding depression. It's probably not a good practice to do this generation over generation for multiple years, but 1 year, maybe 2, coming from a single plant, you're probably going to be okay. So the materials that you need for hand pollinating squash, pretty simple. Packing tape. I like this kind right here on the right, the photo on the right, just the single roll. You aren't going to need more than one roll probably unless you're doing a big operation. It's just easier than kind of the larger cardboard box packaging like tape gun style. This is much easier to handle. Some color ribbon tape. Again, if you only have 1 or 2 plants in your garden, you might not need this, but it's still a really nice thing to have around. You can mark the blossoms that you're taping, and you can also mark the fruits that you're hand pollinating and write information on that, and a permanent marker. Okay, so the second step, once you have your material set, is to identify the male and the female flowers on the squash plant. So squash is pretty easy to identify. The female flowers, they have a small fruit at the base of the blossom. In this case, a zucchini. It's basically just a baby zucchini. And in the case of other squash plants, it just looks like a small version of the mature fruit. So if it's a winter squash or a pumpkin or a round summer squash, you'll just have a little small round green fruit at the base of the flower. And the male flowers just have a long skinny stem at the base of the blossom. In this photo right here, which you'll see in the next slide, this is a perfect example of what the blossoms look like the day before they open. And so that's the next step, is to recognize that, to start to recognize the different stages of the flowers. So right here below this is a really immature male flower. You can see the stem and the blossom just beginning. There isn't even any color to it, it's green. Between this and this stage, it'll continue to yellow, and you'll have kind of an orange tint, or with some varieties or species, it might not be orange, it might be just kind of a darker yellow. If you notice that the flower is kind of limping over, that means it already opened and pollinated, probably the day before, or possibly earlier that day. So these 2 blossoms are going to open the following day. And it'll just take some observation in your garden, on your farm, to check that out. So that's the next step, is to observe that. And you're looking for just kind of a fullness in the flower and that color. And so what you're going to want to do is, when the flowers are at that stage and you recognize they're going to be opening the following morning, you tape them closed in the evening. So you go out with your packing tape and just tape shut, the top half, the top maybe third of the blossom. So fold the tape over, and what that's going to do is just keep the flower from opening in the morning and allowing insects in, or overnight. The flowers are naturally going to stay closed overnight, but sometimes insects will kind of pry their way in. And even if you do tape them shut, sometimes when you open them the following day, you'll notice that an insect somehow worked its way in there. Which in most cases, you'll then just kind of abandon that, because that insect probably carried some pollen in there. So you tape them closed the day before. I usually would just go out in the evening before dark, and that excludes the insects. And so you'll also want to flag the blossom. Sorry, this picture is a little bit blurry, but you get the idea. In this case, this is a female that has probably already been pollinated and retaped shut. But you can also flag any of the blossoms that you tape shut the day before, just so you can come out and find them easily the next morning. This is especially true if you have a little bit of a bigger operation going. And as a general rule, the second or the third fruit on the vine is going to be producing the highest quality seed. So I usually avoid that first female fruit, and we'll go for the second or third. And you know what? If something happens and it doesn't work out on the second or third, you end up needing to hand pollinate the 4th or the 5th or the 6th fruit, it's okay. You're still going to get good stuff, but the highest quality seed usually comes from the second or third fruit. And the reason to note this is because let's say with summer squash, with zucchini, for example, if you pollinate one of those first fruits, like the second or third fruit, and allow it to get to grow to maturity, that's going to take a lot of energy from the plant, and the plant is not going to produce very well any further small, like immature fruits like that you would eat in the edible stage. It will still produce some, but zucchinis really knock them out when you continue to harvest. When you let one go to its maturity, usually it will only produce a couple to that mature size, and maybe some other immature ones. That's why with most winter squashes, especially with the big varieties, they'll only produce 1 or 2 per plant that are really, really big. Some of the smaller varieties will produce, more than that. If they have a lot of fertility, like the Burgess Buttercup I mentioned before, that's a smaller one. We've got 6, 7, 8, even more fruits off of one plant. But usually you only get 1 to 2 large seed fruits off of a squash plant. Okay, so the next step is to come out the next morning after you've taped your blossoms shut and pluck off the male blossoms, including the stem, like the photo here. So keep that tape on there, pluck off the stem, and that's going to be kind of your paintbrush for the pollen. You'll remove the tape and peel off all of the petals, and you're going to end up with just the stem and the anther that has the pollen on it. Then you go over to your female blossom and remove the tape. Now you're going to want to keep the petals intact as much as you can on the female blossom, because you're going to tape it shut after you pollinate to keep any insects coming in after the fact. So in this first photo here, you can see I'm just pulling the tape off of the tip of the flower, opening it up a little bit here, and take the male flower and with the stem and rub the anther all inside the female blossom here, all over the stigma of the female flower. I meant to mention this in one of the previous slides, but I usually will use at least 2 male flowers per female flower, because sometimes you'll notice that the male flower doesn't have that much pollen on it. And this will really ensure that you're getting enough pollen on there. So if you're wanting to cross 2 specific, sorry about that background noise. If you're wanting to cross 2 specific plants, kind of more specific than just maintaining a general variety, but if there's one plant with a certain trait that you're wanting to cross with another plant with a certain trait, then you'll take multiple males from that plant if there are 2 males on that plant in the same stage. Otherwise, if you're just doing some general hand pollination and you have multiple plants that are of a certain quality that you're wanting to breed with, then use multiple male flowers per each female blossom, and you'll want to tape those the evening before too. So what I would do is I would usually go out to the row of squash in the evening, and I would just tape up a whole bunch of males and maybe 2 or 3 females. Just make sure you have enough pollen there. So after you do that hand pollination, then you tape closed the female flower. And you can see in this photo why it's important to keep the petals intact. So you just completely tape that closed, and you mark the fruit with your colored tape. And on that flag, on that colored tape that you wrap around the base of the fruit, and don't tie it too tight, but you're just going to want to tie it around the base kind of loose, like that previous photo. Write the date that you did the hand pollination and any other information. So if you're crossing 2 varieties, you're going to want to write down, for example, the name of the pollen parent. So the pollen parent is the parent variety that you're getting the male flower from, the pollen from, and the seed parent is the female flower plant. So I hope that makes sense. You're going to just want to write down the date there. And the reason you write down the date is because it takes 100 days after pollination to get your mature seed from pretty much all the varieties of squash. So one thing you want to keep an eye out for is for the aborted fruits. And you should be able to notice within a few days, potentially up to a week, if the hand pollination that you did took. So if the female fruit accepted that pollination and starts to form the actual fruit. This photo here shows one that is aborted. In this case, it might not have been because of pollination. I'm seeing in this photo there's two other larger fruits, and sometimes when there's some larger fruits on the plant, it just is kind of tired. It's not going to make any more unless these get harvested. But this is what it looks like if the pollination doesn't work. And if that's the case, just try it again. And that's basically it for squash hand pollination. Again, let's save the Q&A for the end here, and we can go back to these slides, and I can talk more in depth about any of these steps. All right, so corn hand pollination. A lot of people are really interested in this right now, especially because of the issue with GMO cross-pollination. We talked about corn quite a bit in modules. It's wind pollinated. It has a really, really fine pollen that can travel for miles, especially in plains areas with high winds. It can travel for multiple miles. So if you're unable to isolate your corn by at least a mile or two, hand pollination is an easy way to preserve that variety. And corn is also monoecious, just like squash. It has individual male and female flowers. You're going to need a few more kind of specialty materials for corn pollination. And the reason is, you can get away with doing it with simple bags, like sandwich bags, for example. But if you can get pollination bags, it's really going to make your life easier. So the resource to the right here in this slide is Lawson pollinating bags. They actually don't have a website, or this image here is their website. You need to order over the phone, and that phone number is there. They carry both the bags needed for the tassels, or the male flowers, as well as the ear shoots, or the female flowers. So you're going to need some bags. You're going to also want some color ribbon tape if you want to mark the plants that you're hand pollinating, although it can be pretty obvious with the bags on them, but it's just good to have. A stapler. You're definitely going to want a stapler to make sure that you can close those bags up tightly. A permanent marker, just for taking notes, marking the bags, naming the varieties, taking notes on the ribbon. And scissors. Scissors you're going to use for cutting the ear shoot, cutting the tip of the ear shoot before bagging it, and for cutting the silks. So once you have your materials and you've got your corn crop growing, the second step is to cut and bag the ear shoots. So in this photo here, what you see is someone with a pair of scissors cutting off a leaf that is right adjacent to the ear shoot. And so what you want to do is locate the ear shoots before the silks emerge and pollen is shed onto the silks. That's why you want to do this as early as possible. If the silks have already emerged, guaranteed there's pollen on them. It's so light, and if you have a good population of corn going, which you should, the pollen is just everywhere. And so you're going to want to cut and bag those before the silks emerge. The timing for this is you're going to start to look for those ear shoots when the plants are starting to tassel, which is the male flower at the very top of the plant. Once you start to see the tassels emerge, you're going to look for the ear shoots. The male tassel at the top of the plant usually is going to emerge first before the ear shoots, but sometimes only by a few days. So you start to see those, start to hunt around for the ear shoots. And they are between the leaf and the stalk. So this is the tip of an ear shoot, and the leaf has already been removed from the plant here. You can either cut it back, or you can actually just kind of tear it off the plant, and you'll just cut the very tip of the shoot. Okay, and the main reason to do this is to just allow for more room in the bag. So you cut the very tip of it when it's a few inches long, and cut back that leaf, place the bag over the shoot, and staple it closed. So here's another photo. You can see again the leaf here has been cut This is the top of the leaf that was cut, and then the actual shoot itself was cut back as well. And this photo is showing the bag just kind of claiming space between the stalk and the shoot. Then you'll take your shoot bag, you can see the word Lawson across this bag, the Lawson pollinator bags, and just put that over the shoot and kind of pinch it shut and staple it at the bottom. So after you have your ear shoots bagged, the next step is to bag the tassels, and this should be kind of around the same time or probably a few days later. The whole process usually takes less than 2 weeks from when you start to see the tassels pollinate to when the whole process is finished. So you want to cover the tassels entirely with pollination bags. You can use basic paper bags in an area with humidity at night or with potentials like summer rains. You're going to want to use the special pollination bags that are waxed. You can get those from the same place from that Lawson company. There's another company called Seedboro that also sells pollination bags. I believe they're of a different brand, but either resource should be good for that. And the timing for bagging the tassels is when you see the anthers begin to emerge at the outer tips of the tassel branches. So this photo right here in the center is a perfect example of when these tassels should be bagged. Here's the branches of the tassel, and you can see at the end of it, the anthers kind of hanging off. Here's a close-up of the anthers, what they look like. They're kind of hanging off at the end. Now, when you get towards the inner part of that branch, they haven't opened yet. You don't see the anthers hanging. You're going to want to find that sweet spot right when those anthers are starting to open up and hang at the end of the branches and bag it. If you bag early, you know, a day or two before this, you're probably okay. But if you bag when the tassels are just coming out when they're green, they're not going to make pollen. There's something about being exposed to the air and the sunlight and the circulation that allows the pollen to be produced from the anthers. So don't bag it too early. Cover the anther or the tassel completely and staple it tightly shut. So a few days and maybe up to a week after you bag your tassels is when you're going to want to collect your pollen. It's best to do it in the afternoon, as there's often dew on the plants, on the bags in the morning. Wait till everything's kind of dry and collect it in the afternoon. And the way to do this is to bend the top of the plant over so that the bag essentially, when it's on the plant, it's upside down. Bend it so the bag is right side up. Remove the staple or open it up and just kind of shake the tassel out some more into the bag, trying to collect as much pollen as you can. What you're going to want to do then, and a general practice for this, is to collect pollen from as many plants as you can. You're going to want to include the pollen from as large a population as possible to hand pollinate the ears. It's not so important that you use a lot of different ears as it is that you get a lot of pollen. So even if you were to save from a couple of ears, the more plants you can collect pollen from, the better. And what you're gonna want to do is repeat this process of pollen collection by bending the plant over, shaking into the bag, and then consolidate all of that pollen. So pour all of that pollen into one bag and shake it up really well. If you're doing this with multiple varieties in your garden or on your farm, let's say you're doing a grow out. For example, they do grow outs on they'll do hand pollination grow outs on a lot of, like on the Seed Savers Exchange farm, the Heritage Farm, or on Native Seed Search in Arizona. They'll grow out a dozen varieties or more at one time. So if that's the case, there's a lot of cleanliness strategies that you need to follow that I'm not even discussing here to keep the pollen from crossing it so light, like cleaning your hands and any tools you're using with hand sanitizer pretty often. And obviously, anytime you're doing pollen collection, making sure that none of it is mixing up. So shake it all in a bag together to mix up all the pollen within a single variety. So the last step is to actually pollinate the silks from the ear shoot. And you can see the first photo here. There's an ear shoot bag that has some pollen in it, and they're dusting it onto the silks. So once you take off the ear shoot bag from the ear shoot that you have bagged, once you remove that, cut the silks to about 2 inches long. It just makes the process easier with the bagging. They might be kind of long. It's not necessary. They're only that long to try to collect pollen from the wind and have a more surface area. But if you're going to dump a couple of spoonfuls of pollen onto the thing, go ahead and cut it back to a couple of inches. You can actually tell from this photo that this was cut. Dust some pollen on there, and however much pollen you put, even the amount that they've already put here is probably way more than is necessary, but better to do it more than less. Dust that on there really well, and then put this same bag onto that ear shoot. Or I'm sorry, these ear shoot bags are mainly just to protect the ear shoot before pollination. After you do it, you can take the tassel bags to cover that. And the reason for that is after the pollination, the ear shoot's going to grow into a large ear of corn. You're going to need more space usually. So the second photo shows using that tassel bag to cover up the already pollinated ear shoot, stapling it really tightly closed. And that's essentially the process of hand pollinating the corn. Pretty simple for squash and corn. Like I mentioned, there are some other tricks when it comes to dealing with multiple varieties to making sure that the varieties don't cross. And again, like I mentioned, the most important thing is to ensure that population size. Bare minimum of corn is 100 plants. If you can grow more, the better. If you're hand pollinating, I would suggest doing at least a half dozen ears and at least a dozen plants with pollen. If you can do more, that's better. But that should get you started. And it's not, this is kind of something you do to maintain a variety, to keep it from crossing. But even, with the minimum population suggestions of 100 or 200 plants, you can imagine that taking pollen from a dozen plants and dusting it on a half dozen ears, that you are limiting that population size. So this is a method for isolation. It's not a general practice to carry on a variety indefinitely. Eventually, you're going to want to take whatever variety you're hand pollinating in this manner and do a really large scale grow out in a place that's distance isolated from any other corn crop, because you're going to want to reinvigorate that variety with a larger population. But this is a method that works well. It's a way to maintain varieties. So like with the native seed search example, they have hundreds of really, really rare varieties, mainly from the Southwest, like indigenous tribes. And they know that those seeds are only going to last for so long in storage. So it's better for them to do a grow out, do a hand pollination like this to keep that variety going. It's better to do that than to allow the seeds to completely lose their viability. They have so many varieties that they can't do a distance isolated grow out of one variety every year. So they have to do, a dozen to 20 varieties every year in this manner. And eventually, or at the same time, on a different farm that might be better isolated, do large scale grow outs of maybe the more popular varieties that they can collect more seed from and keep that variety vigorous with a larger population. Okay, so I'm going to talk about storage just for a few minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A, and we can go back over the squash or the corn pollination process if anyone has questions. Storage is pretty basic. I generally like to encourage folks to keep it simple. These slides are from a PDF that I put together, a little infographic that I'll put a download link to on the portal page tonight. And the simpler the better. I actually get quite a lot of questions about seed storage from people, and a lot of people are coming from a place of like long-term storage, like the apocalypse is coming and I want to make sure I have seeds for my survival garden. How can I keep the seeds well for many, many years? And there's something to that, and there are strategies for that. But for general seed storage, and I think most of us here are avid gardeners or farmers, so we're going to be growing and using the seed year over year. Keep it simple. You don't need to put it in a Mylar bag in a 5-gallon bucket with desiccants and liquid nitrogen to absorb the oxygen, sealed up and hidden in a root cellar. Like, you just don't need to store your seeds like that. If you want to do that with one lot of like a bunch of varieties just to have that peace of mind, go for it. But basically, keep it simple. The 3 rules: dry, dark, and cool. You want to keep them dry, you want to keep them dark, at least out of direct sunlight, and keep the temperatures as cool as possible. Okay, so dry. Each 1% reduction in moisture doubles the life of the seed. So that's a pretty incredible statistic. And that's not air moisture, but seed moisture. So if you've got a lot of seeds, of corn seeds, for example, and they still have like a 10% moisture content in the seeds, and that gets reduced to 9%, the life of that seed in storage has doubled just because of getting it more dry. 100% dryness isn't always necessary. A little bit of moisture in the seed sometimes is okay. But once you get above 30% moisture, seeds are going to start to germinate, which is obviously not what you want. Generally speaking, just get it as dry as you can and seal it up. If you're having trouble getting your seeds dry, leave them out on a warm day, out of the direct sun. If it's cooler temperatures, go ahead and put them in the direct sun for the sake of getting them dry. If your temperatures are in the 70s or lower and you have a sunny day, you've got some seeds that still need to dry, then go ahead and put them in the direct sun on a screen or something just to make sure they get dry. Large seeds, you can test the dryness by smashing it with a hammer. If it shatters, then you know it's dry. If it's soft and kind of squishes, you know they need to dry more. Darkness, keep them out of direct sunlight. And with some seeds, especially if there's a tiny bit of moisture present, the sunlight can actually trigger germination with light-dependent germinators like lettuce, for example. It's less important than the moisture or temperature, but light will reduce the seed's viability, especially direct sunlight. A dark closet is good. A garage is great. A basement works well. A cold, a root cellar is a great place. And the refrigerator or the freezer. So here's another great statistic about temperature. A 10% reduction in the temperature of the seed will double the seed life. So the drier and the cooler, the better, the longer it's going to store. And once you get that seed below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, very few insects are gonna go after the seed. So if you have it stored in an area that's higher than 50, you'd be surprised the situations that insects can work themselves into. We've had seeds double bagged in like Ziploc bags, a large amount of seed that had insects work their way through that. Double bagged, and then within a file cabinet, within a sealed building that was kept pretty cool. So that we changed our methods after that. But yeah, the insects can work their way in. So the cooler, the better. Above 80 degrees Fahrenheit consistently, the seeds rapidly lose their germination rate. Pretty rapidly. Brief exposure to those temperatures, no big deal. But if you have your seeds stored in a place where it's above 80 Fahrenheit, they're not going to last very long. The refrigerator is a great place to store seeds. The main consideration for this is that they must be stored in completely non-permeable containers only, because the refrigerator is very humid. So a tightly sealed glass jar is your best bet for the refrigerator and for the freezer, actually. If you're storing in the freezer, only store them in glass, and the seeds must be completely dry. As you probably know, moisture expands as it freezes. Water expands when it freezes. So if your seeds are moist, you put them in the freezer, they're going to be damaged by that expanding moisture. I like the freezer for long-term storage. and you have to use a non-permeable container again. Glass, I would only use a glass jar or a glass container of some sort that's totally sealed in the freezer. The most important thing to note if you're storing in the freezer is, and this applies to the refrigerator as well, but mainly to the freezer because of the cooler temperatures. When you pull your seeds out of the freezer to access them, if you're going to be planting your seeds that are stored there, you open the lid, warm air rushes in to the container, and if you seal that lid up, you've just trapped a whole bunch of condensation moisture on the inside of the jar. So if you pull that jar out of the freezer to get your seeds, it's very important that you allow the jar, the actual glass of the jar, and all the seeds to come to room temperature and be completely dried out before you seal it up and put it back in the freezer. Here's a little chart for just kind of general longevity of seeds in storage. Now this is really generally speaking, and seeds of course can last much longer than this. This is kind of a safe chart as far as the longevity goes. So you can safely store seeds, especially if you have them in the conditions I just mentioned. They're definitely going to store for this amount of time. But some of these longer ones like eggplant or pumpkin, squash, any of the brassicas, if they can definitely store longer than 4 or 5 years in the right conditions. But this is safe. So if you have a variety that you're really trying to care for, and the last time you grew it out for seed was 5 years ago, let's say cabbage, for example, you're going to want to do another grow out just to be safe. Again, I'm going to link you to download of this PDF here. But if this is just something to keep in mind, anytime you have varieties that you're wanting to maintain, keep an eye out for the amount of time that they store. Parsnip, onion and parsley, that'll be like 1 to 2 years, sometimes longer. Parsnip is just, it's a year. You're lucky if you get longer than a year on parsnip. It just doesn't last. So that's a very challenging seed crop that you need to grow actually every year because of the short viability. All of the others are usually multiple years, and it's good to just keep all these numbers in mind when it comes to how often you need to grow out your varieties. A couple other things to keep in mind. Seeds are living. They will deteriorate even in the most ideal storage conditions. You all have probably heard of the date palm seed found in a tomb in Egypt that's thousands of years old, and they got it to germinate. That probably was the absolute ideal condition, right, for preserving anything. Amazing, absolutely amazing. Not something you should count on, and they will deteriorate even in the perfect conditions, especially vegetable seeds. Just imagining, you know, the evolution of agriculture. Seeds are grown every year to be planted every year, and vegetables and vegetable seeds are entirely a part of, you know, agriculture and domestication. So they're not really all that vigorous when it comes to being on their own and lasting for a really long time. So dry, dark, and cool. Don't overthink it. Don't overcomplicate it. And that is it for today's class. Next week, so I'm actually thinking of combining the last couple of modules. I was thinking of having an 8th module simply for a conclusion and a Q&A. But I think that I'm going to combine them all and make next week the final week. And we're going to talk about resources. So all of the resources that are already there on the student portal page, I'm going to link you to any other resources for seed saving and seed growing, maybe some general gardening and farming resources. We'll kind of conclude the class and talk about some next steps for anybody who's kind of wanting to take this to the next level, which if you're part of this class, you probably are. And then we'll do a good long Q&A for anything that you feel didn't get covered in the class, that's what we're going to cover next week. Does that sound good? All right. So let's go ahead and do a Q&A for today's class. Shoot away in the chat box. Let me know if you have any questions about hand pollinating squash, corn and corn hand pollination, or seed storage, or just in general, but I'd like to address any questions pertaining to this class first. Fire away. Okay, Teresa, how long does it take for things like squash and cucumbers to flower after planting the seeds? Short season, reasonable to get seeds from them if they take 100 days after pollination? Good question, Teresa. I would say yes, that a short season is reasonable, mainly because you can self-pollinate even a single plant, and that single plant you can protect pretty well from freezing. So if it's kind of getting long in the season and your fruits are not quite mature yet, and you've got a couple of frost, like cold nights coming, you can cover those up. And you can also harvest them a tiny bit early. I think we discussed this in the Q&A last week or the previous Saturday, but definitely. And how long does it take for things like squash and cucumbers to flower after planting the seeds? It really depends on the variety. And what you'll also see is that the male flowers show up first. But I would say that it's usually about 30 days, maybe 4 to 6 weeks for them to start flowering. If it's really hot and it's a really vigorous, fast one like a zucchini, that's probably more on the 4-week side of things. You're probably looking at more like 6 weeks for melons, cucumbers, possibly earlier. But I would say it's definitely reasonable for a short season, especially if you can do some season extension on both ends of the season. So if you can start your plants in a greenhouse or hothouse maybe a week or two before, maybe like 2 weeks before you plan to plant them out, I wouldn't keep them indoors for too long because they grow so quickly, they get root bound really easily. And then, like I said, if you've got fruits in the field that are just about ready, either protect the individual plant, throw a couple of blankets over them, or some of the thickest frost cloth that you can get from a place like Johnny's. But absolutely, I would give it a try. Yeah. And the other, a quick side story related to that, Teresa, that I always thought was like super inspiring. Was the story that was shared with me from my friend Bill McDorman, who runs Seed School. He told me a story about this grower in the mountains. I don't believe it was somewhere in Eastern Europe, who was given some watermelon seeds, and he was only given a few seeds, like a handful of seeds. And what he did was he planted one seed one spring. It germinated, and the plant grew out. And this is a really short season, like up in the mountains, right? The plant grew out and it didn't produce a single fruit. Okay, so it didn't have what was needed it didn't have a long enough season to produce that fruit to get seeds from. He tried it again next year and got one fruit. He saved the seeds from that and did it again next year. And through the course of 3 or 4 years, he had essentially a variety of watermelon that was adapted to this super high altitude short season. So that's another method, Teresa, is rather than maybe being super attached to one variety and trying to force it, maybe try a few different varieties. You can even do a little search. I don't know off the top of my head shorter season squash varieties, but you could search for varieties. Maybe try a few of them, and perhaps there are some of them that pollinate or that start to open and pollinate earlier. And maybe they produce something mature before 100 days. The 100 days is kind of generic. So I would maybe take a twofold approach. Plan on doing some season extension and try a few different varieties or a few different species. If it's winter squash you're wanting to work with, try one cucurbita pepo, one cucurbita machata, like a butternut, one cucurbita maxima, like a Burgess or a Hubbard, and try that route. Thanks for the question, Teresa. Dustin, how many yellow squash would you need to plant to harvest a pound of squash seeds? Yellow, like the yellow summer squash, I'm going to guess is what you mean, like a crookneck. That is a really good question. Let me see. Let me just look up something really quick. Squash seeds per pound. That'll give me a basic guess. Okay, so we're looking at, let's see, about 7,000 seeds per pound. Okay. $7,000 seeds per pound, and let's just estimate that you're going to get 50 seeds in a fruit, although you might be able to get more. So 50 into 7,000 is 140. So I would say plan on 140. Would be maybe a conservative estimate. So a pound of seed, I would say a minimum of 30 plants. If you planted 50, you'd probably be good to go. Aaron, is it a bad idea to eat flowers, immature squash, and try to hand pollinate and keep seeds? No, that's a great idea. The more plants, the better. And like I said, you know, once you have, it sounds like you're asking about summer squash specifically. Let's just use zucchini for an example. That seed parent, the plant that you're going to have the maturing seed producing fruit on, don't try to get more than 2 seed fruits from that plant. And if you only do 1, you're going to get more edible fruit. So if it's important that you get some edible zucchini and edible flowers from the plant, shoot for just 1 seed fruit per plant, and that'll help encourage the plant to still have enough energy to make fruits that you can eat immature. As far as the flowers go, as soon as you have the pollination that you need from that plant, then you can eat a lot of flowers. If you just have a couple of plants, you're not going to be able to do as many because you'll need those flowers to be opening and producing pollen for the edible fruits that you're going to harvest. But if you have even a half dozen plants, you should have plenty of food and seed. So let's say you do a half dozen plants. I would take 2 of those plants for seed producing, maybe 3, and the rest of them used for food, and you know, eat blossoms. Like there's always more male blossoms than female. Most of the time it's like a 2-to-1 ratio. So a lot of the times you can eat half of the male blossoms that are present, and they're usually, the best eating is kind of the same day that you would tape them up, like the day before they open. So you should be able to do both, for sure. But if you plan on getting 2 seed fruits per plant, unless those plants are like, they have a lot of fertility present and the soil is just rocking and you've got a lot of water to work with, they're going to kind of struggle to make any decent amount of edible fruits that you can harvest immature. That answer your question, Aaron? And, Dustin, to go back to your question, with the yellow squash, those are a little bit of a smaller seed, meaning lighter in weight. So you could be, you might want to go on the higher end of that estimation of plants. You might want to shoot more for 50 plants to produce a pound of seed. Though I don't know, that is a smaller fruit too, so you could probably get away with doing 2 seed fruits per plant on the yellow squash. It's a little bit smaller than a zucchini. We have access to a site that gives us a number of seeds can be harvested per plant. Dustin, I don't know of one, but let me ask around and see if I can dig something up for you. I know that there is out there. There is that resource out there, and some of the more legitimate, like maybe the Organic Seed Grower, the book by John Navazio, might be give you a better idea of seeds per plant. But I can't think of a single resource that has them all listed like that. But I will look around and see if I can find something and let you know. And if I do, I will also put that up on the portal page. No problem. Good question. We always just kind of did the individual calculations based on, we had limited space on our farm. So we would always kind of compare what were the options for buying seed. Like if we could buy the seed from a legitimate source, an organic grower that was really growing good quality seed and repackage that, we would, if it made sense. And in some cases that made better sense than to grow it out. But maybe the seed was very expensive or hard to find. And so we would have to plan around that. And then just kind of find seeds per fruit, then think about number of fruits per plant, number of seeds in a pound. So if you're going for weight or quantity, yeah. Dustin, trying to balance out saving seeds and having food for market. Space is tight. Yeah, I totally understand that. The squash is a good one for that, though, actually, because I'm imagining you're row cropping on your farm, probably. And as we all know, summer squash, zucchini usually is a better producer than yellow squash. In fact, we had it producing 2 or 3 times the yield. But space is tight, saving seeds and having food for market. And a good one for that also in the summertime is tomatoes. You can save a lot of tomato seed from your tomatoes. Dustin, I'm not sure if you're planning on selling the seeds. I think you mentioned that you are. Tomatoes is a good one because they produce so prolifically. You can do different harvests. You can harvest for your market one day, and then 3 days later harvest for seeds, and the plants are just loaded again, right? But the yellow squash, for sure. You don't even have to hand pollinate with that one. It's a pretty generic variety. What I would do is just do, I'm missing the actual term for it. Just do it like an open pollination seed project with the yellow squash. So rather than hand pollinating, pick the best like 10, or let's say more than that if you're looking for a pound of seed. If you got a long row or a couple of rows, pick like the best 30 plants, 40 plants. Put a little flag, like a landscaping flag, right in the center of the plant to mark it. And from that plant, let that second or third or fourth fruit go, and either flag that fruit, flag the plant. Everything else, harvest after that, and then all of your other plants in the row are good. But just do like an observation of the phenotype of what is actually visible, what you can see. What is the structure of the plant? Is it producing good fruits? Is it resistant to any mildews that are around? Is it being hit by pests less? So just make that general observation and select from those plants without a hand pollination. Even though it's still going to be probably crossing up with some of the other plants that aren't being selected, you're still saving the genetics from that seed parent no matter what. And you'll kind of get to an ideal phenotype, an ideal variety expression slower by doing this sort of a mass selection is actually what we called it, than you would a hand pollination, but it's much, much easier and much less time intensive, which sounds like that's important for you, Dustin. That's what I would suggest. Aaron, what is the drawback to pollinating one tassel to one cob instead of combining all the pollen from the cobs? Good question, Aaron. I actually watched a video recently of someone at Native Seed Search doing their pollination from a single tassel to a single cob. And the drawback for that is basically you're just taking the genetics from only two plants. I would at least suggest doing it from two different plants in the same plant. So that's just the drawback, Aaron, is that you're limiting the genetics being mixed up, and essentially you're essentially encouraging any inbreeding depression, even though you're directly crossing those two different individuals. It's always better to combine the pollen. So I had watched a couple of videos recently. The first one was the Native Seed Search. They were doing from one tassel to one cob to one silk. And then there was something else from Seed Savers Exchange, and they were doing the pollen mixing up from multiple plants. And so that just makes sense. If for whatever reason you have a small population growing and that's your only option, by all means. But if you have the option to save pollen from multiple plants, you're going to be better off. So I guess maybe a shorter answer for that would be no matter how you're doing it, whether it's from a single plant or multiple plants, you're always going to want to take that saved seed from that single cob or a few cobs, and you're going to want to save that seed, and you're going to want to eventually, whether the next year or a few years down the road, grow that out into a larger population. So that might entail finding a location where you can do a legitimate distance isolation. The hand pollination of corn is kind of a stopgap. It's something that you do because you have to keep a variety pure. It's not an ideal by any means. So if you're doing it, I strongly suggest taking pollen from at least a half dozen plants. If you can do it from more, the better. Great question, Aaron. Yeah. Dustin, next spring you'll have seeds for sale at the markets. Awesome. It's very cool. Yeah, it can be challenging doing seed and food. It can, and in some cases impossible, but the more, another really good one, Dustin, is lettuce. So what we would do is direct sow really thickly. So we'd take our, like an earthway seeder and just drill it really thick. And every single stage of selection was food for our CSA and for you for market. So we could come through and thin really aggressively, just knife cut at the soil level and wash and sell bagged lettuce. And then a couple weeks after that, we could cut out single plants. And the whole time you're doing a negative selection, you're roguing, right? You know that maybe that's eventually you're going to have one plant every 2 or 3 feet going to seed. And so you can come through and make multiple harvests simply by roguing, by doing that negative selection. So lettuce is a good one. Any of the brassicas are good ones too. Broccoli is a good one. We would do like a bagged, quote unquote, stir fry greens with chard thinnings and with broccoli thinnings. There's quite a few that you can get away with doing like that. Good questions, everyone, for sure. Does anybody have any other questions for me today? All right, that seems like that might be it for the Q&A. Thank you for the awesome questions. I really, really enjoy doing the Q&As at the end of the sessions and on Saturdays. So thank you, everybody, for coming to the class today. And next week will be the final module, Module 7. We'll talk about the resources, and we'll do a good conclusion, a final Q&A. If there's anything that any of you all feel I haven't covered, please send me an email and make sure that you let me know if there's something you want me to cover next week. I'll be sure to include it. So thank you so much for the excellent questions, and we'll see you hopefully on Saturday morning. All right. Be well, everybody. Thank you.